Hi, everyone. My name is Jared McCormick. I am a clinical assistant professor and the director of graduate studies here at the Kevorkian Center. I want to welcome everyone back to our online series here that will span across the year. We were just talking beforehand, we very much were hoping to have this in person. Parts of this perhaps might have an in-person component in the spring, but here we are yet again on Zoom. For programming. So again, welcome to familiar faces, people that are new. I just want to highlight very quickly in the chat, we'll be posting the final product of two of our series from last year, Global Uprising and Digital Forays. These were platforms that were built with student work from our core curriculum here, and you can see all of the prior videos there. Also in the chat, we'll be posting the upcoming events here at the Kevorkian Center for the semester and also in this series. So to offer some framing remarks, this series, which will span the entire academic year with 4 events in the fall and 4 in the spring, is entitled Elements of Border and Infrastructure. And across this series, we'll explore transitions, processes that connect borders and infrastructures around us, but through this lens of elements. And so elements here might suggest a meaning of characteristics. However, this series is a little bit more atmospheric, affective, and perhaps even a little bit abstract in how we look at connections anew that hope to span time and place from the normal terms of how we think about things and also how we oftentimes approach that in our own research. So this might be certain zones, sites of mediation, changing states, this gray in-between that oftentimes is in between disciplines itself. So the 4 elements are air, fire, water, and earth. And these are things that surround us. They're needed for life. They're ubiquitous. And here we're using this as a playful and wide-reaching lens to frame the series across the 4 elements this semester, and the 4 elements air, fire, water, and earth will appear again in a separate iteration in the spring. So this is water number 1 in the series. And just walking into my office this morning, I was thinking about this upcoming event, and I was thinking about, what you learn in school of the percentage of water in your body. And then I was thinking of the percentage of air and the percentage of water in the air as the humidity. I was thinking back to a couple of weeks ago of the rain and the flooding with Hurricane Ida here in New York. And here in this panel, we're framing water as something that is about scarcity. We might think of reservoirs and aquifers. And we also might think about the abundance, or actually the overabundance of water in some of the rivers, the streets, or even as the oceans rise. And so in this session, we think about control, movement, power, but really how water's flow in turn shapes the world we inhabit and that we study. So a quick note about format. We have 3 esteemed guests, and we're asking each of them in 10 or 15 minutes to broadly put their intervention, something on the table. And through that, we're hoping a conversation emerges, different threads come out. I encourage everyone in the audience to, in the chat, put any references, questions you have. The first part of the program will be about 45 minutes with their contributions, and then we'll turn to Q&A with the panelists discussing amongst themselves and also with you all. So moving on, let me just introduce everyone. We have Nikhil Anand, who is an associate professor of anthropology at UPenn. We have Chris Lowe, an assistant professor of history at Iowa State, and Ekin Kurtic, who is at the Crown Center at Brandeis. And rather than give the full esteemed introductions they deserve, we'll be posting information in the chat when they each start. So with that being said, I will turn over the table to Nikhil, and we will get started.
Thanks so much, Jared, and thanks also to Jim Ryan and folks at the Kevorkian Center for inviting me to this conversation. We are actually living in very interesting times where we're speaking and thinking not so much of a periodic table of elements, but elements far fewer and far older in a sense. And I think this is in part on account of the worlds of the Enlightenment that are sort of like in the categories of the Enlightenment that are sort of like collapsing all around us. My work focuses on the politics and lives of water in Mumbai. I'm situated east of the Middle East. I'm somewhat of an interloper on this conversation, so thank you for having me. My first book was focused on the ways in which water infrastructures produce cities and relationships of inequality in Mumbai. And I'm currently conducting research to think about ways in which the seas and the social and ecological processes of seas are precipitating a rethinking of urban processes in Mumbai, but I think also more broadly. Now, thinking across these two different projects, I had a few thoughts to share around questions of efforts to control and shape water, and also in so doing shape our understandings of the Middle East as a region. And I'll be drawing a lot on work of scholars that I've learned from, that have worked in the Middle East on these topics, right? The first is that scarcity, though we might think of it as a real, is not a biophysical phenomenon alone, or even mostly. As Samir Alatut has shown, scarcity is wielded, is produced and managed as a political tool to secure the legitimacy of states and the ways in which they manage water. I think landscape architects and designers, Dilip da Cunha and Anuradha Mathur, remind us that water is actually everywhere before it is made somewhere, right? And so those making somewheres are processes of making not just water, but also regions and polities, right? And we see many waters everywhere in the Middle East. I'm thinking of the work of Mandana Limbat, as also in Western India. I'm thinking of the work of Laila Mehta, who show that there are different kinds of water that are sensed and recognized. They oftentimes have different names depending on their sources or salinity, and oftentimes put to different uses, right? So when we talk about water scarcity, what we're actually talking about is a shortage of a particular kind of water that is produced through modern infrastructural practices to hydrate cities, hydrate nations and agriculture, and so on and so forth. So to the extent that there is a scarcity of water, it is not a scarcity of waters in its capacious sense, but a particular kind of water, what Ivan Illich calls H2O, that is made by large water infrastructures that themselves are accretions of capital, technology, and state power. And these infrastructures that I've written about elsewhere oftentimes call and produce forgettings of other kinds of water that that we cohabit the earth with, right? So as massive infrastructures, these dams, dikes, and so on, redistribute our waters. They produce borders and boundaries, not just between nation states, and we're very aware of these conflicts between nation states around the access of rivers and so on, but they also produce boundaries between what we imagine to be rural and urban areas, with water frequently being moved to urban areas as a way of both producing abjection in dried up hinterlands and hydration, differential those may be in the city. So in this way, like not unlike the work of Tim Mitchell, who shows how global policies are made through the slowing down of oil, policies in the Middle East, within the Middle East and across different regions are made by reducing what water means and controlling where that water actually goes. Now, present-day challenges of climate change do disrupt our conceptions of both water and the region. Now, frequently we'll talk about the ways in which the future war, the next world war will be a war over water, right? And these very securitized ways of understanding not just water, but also the possibility of collaboration and the inevitability of conflict. Now, climate change in some ways disrupts these narratives because it disrupts our understandings of water as a reliably available resource, or a resource that is particularly scarce at different scales, right? And so I want to think about the ways in which climate change in some ways unsettles our understandings of where water is or where water is not. Water wars depend on ideas of scarcity, which, as I pointed out earlier, depend on forgetting and not seeing all the waters that permeate our planet. And climate change and the events of climate change, we mentioned Hurricane Ida, Tropical Storm Ida, but also other kinds of extreme weather events require we see water otherwise as neither scarce nor just as H2O, right? The flood waters that permeate our highways in Philadelphia or basement apartments in New York require us to see waters in multiplicities and also in mixtures, right? And I'm thinking much of Katerina Scarmelli's work and Fabio's work of understanding how wetlands and wetscapes are inhabited in Turkey. Climate change also presents different qualities and temporalities of water. So for example, we have cyclones in the Arabian Sea now, which are a new phenomenon that affect residents of Oman as much as they do residents of Mumbai. Warming seas and fish die-offs, much as a result of hypoxic waters and algal blooms that I think Ekin will be talking about in a little while as well, but are also very much present in the Arabian Sea. Rain events in warmed atmospheres appear more at once and are less reliable to projects of modeling and hydropolitical control that have long been the features of modernist water provisioning. So in this sense, I think we might need to approach the globality of hydropolitics and water infrastructure in new ways. And so doing also unsettle our categories, not just of water and infrastructure, but also of the Middle East itself. Hydropolitics always emerges in particular locations as a gathering of histories, practices, and infrastructures. Infrastructures, as I mentioned, are in some ways hydropolitical machines seeking to create reliable grounds, hydraulic grounds on which social life can be staged. They sustain many cities and nations, and we're all living on the benefits of those hydropolitical machines these days. But they're also always falling apart, and climate change is making their leaking seams ever more visible. So how might thinking of other extant water, histories of water in cities and in nations, right? Water as plural and water in the present future, how might those kinds of approaches not only change our understandings of water, but also unsettle categories of regions like the Middle East? And with that, I'll conclude.
Great, thank you so much for getting us started. We'll turn now to Chris Lowe.
All right, can everyone see my screen? Hopefully give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
All right, perfect. So thanks again to Jared and Jim for organizing, and my co-panelists for sharing the stage. I've really enjoyed looking at their draft thoughts this morning. So let me just go ahead and jump right in with a couple of observations. And these are sort of issues about Middle Eastern historiography and sort of the shape of the region and ways in which I think water sort of fits into those existing problems. So first, I want to sort of frame my intervention by pointing out that Middle Eastern studies continues to primarily revolve around a kind of Mediterranean core, stretching from Egypt and the Levant up through the Ottoman Empire and its sort of Anatolian heartland. And in this case, the Arabian Peninsula, which I'm focusing on, is often viewed as a kind of almost separate region, only included and only begrudgingly included when the discussion turns to oil. And a second observation here is, despite the fact that environmental history in recent years has really taken root in Middle Eastern history, again, there's a sort of imbalance and the Arabian Peninsula lags behind, right? So when we think about the sort of heartlands of environmental history, we think about the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, again, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. The Arabian Peninsula somehow falls off the map. right? And I find this curious in part because changes to the water systems and water infrastructures in the region have been profound in the 20th and 21st century, even into the 19th century as well, moving us from things like water carriers and brackish wells and filage systems of aqueducts to modern infrastructures of desalination. So I think it's a sort of undisputed truism that the story of the 20th century Arabian Peninsula is, of course, synonymous with oil. That's an unavoidable fact. The discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf states really transformed these societies and economies. And particularly after the 1973 oil crisis, exploding oil prices really launched one of world history's most spectacular transfers of human wealth. Now, the development of these so-called rentier states has allowed Gulf rulers to provide lavish social welfare services to their subjects and given rise to glittering cities like Doha and Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And while oil and gas pipelines and refineries have rightfully been understood as the infrastructural lifeblood of this growth, another set of pipelines and processing plants has remained virtually invisible in our historical imagination, and that is desalination facilities. Now, despite this seeming invisibility, all Gulf states have embraced fossil-fueled solutions to address their acute water problems. Here, I would argue that desalination and fossil-fueled water production has become a defining material feature of life on the Arabian Peninsula. The region's sort of transition toward total dependency on desalination has ushered in an era from which really there is no escape. Since the 1970s, oil and water production have become inextricably linked. Not only have oil revenues subsidized impossibly low water prices and artificially elevated levels of consumption, oil itself has become the key ingredient in the manufacture of the vast majority of the region's water. Partly as a result of the carbon-intensive nature of transforming salt water into fresh water, Gulf kingdoms are now among the world's leading per capita consumers of both oil and water. However, this energy-intensive solution to the region's absolute water scarcity depends on the conceit that oil production will indefinitely keep pace with the development that it has enabled. But unlike the technopolitical alchemy of turning crude oil into government revenue or private wealth, the production and consumption of desalinated water has fostered an even deeper material and infrastructural dependency. Now, here I often think and am reminded of Abdurrahman Munif's sort of imagery in Cities of Salt. And I've tried to adapt this idea into something like cities of salt water or saltwater kingdoms to kind of encapsulate this specific form of rentier state activity that he so effectively satirized. And although different from the vulnerability that he had in mind in his novels, I would say that desalination and its interdependence with fossil fuels only underscores the vulnerabilities looming over the climate-altered horizon that we're now approaching. Now, not unlike the problematic environmental imaginary of endless energy, desalination infrastructures have allowed Gulf states to imagine their water supplies as infinitely expandable. And despite their growing recognition of a kind of looming post-oil future, through the free flow of subsidized water, Gulf monarchies continue to reassure their subjects that carbon-centric lifestyles will endure for the foreseeable future. Indeed, both in the Gulf and more globally, desalination is often positioned as a kind of green solution to climate change, despite its sort of symbiotic relationship with fossil fuels themselves. In the Gulf, this of course raises the question of an impending collision between lowered fossil fuel demand globally and the region's continued dependence on fossil fuels to both power and fund its water systems. In this sense, desalination is a kind of interesting case as both a solution to environmental stress and a direct contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and rapid warming. This case is particularly acute when we consider climate projections that forecast wet bulb temperatures and humidity levels that stand to make everyday life in the Gulf and South Asia really hazardous to human health as soon as perhaps the year 2050 or at the latest 2070 or 2080. Thus, as we watch this sort of aggressive environmental branding of the Dubai 2020 Expo, I can't help but see this as precisely the kind of dilemma captured in Gökçe Gönel's remarkable book, The Spaceship in the Desert, about Abu Dhabi's Masdar City project and its green visions of a kind of status quo future, right? So a kind of greenwashing of the present system, right? So as a historian and someone who started out in Ottoman history, how the heck did I get here, I guess is one question that we might ask. And this was really a kind of fortuitous set of accidents. I went into the Ottoman archives looking for material on cholera. I was looking at pilgrims carrying cholera from India. And of course, sort of stupidly, I should have been looking for water infrastructures. And that's ultimately the material that I found in the Ottoman archives. And really sort of my first encounter with thinking about this was tugboats equipped with compressors bringing water to Jeddah and Yanbu'a during Hajj season, and ultimately the construction of the first sort of standalone desalination plant in Jeddah just before World War I. Now, this sort of longer history, I think, is important for us to rethink where we're headed as well. And here I'd like to point to On Barak's wonderful book, Powering Empire. And here he really joins me in pointing out that desalination technology is not actually a child of the post-1970s oil boom. Indeed, desalination was born of coal and steam, Indian Ocean Empire, and military and colonial logistical emergencies that necessitated the construction of desalination systems on board steamships and eventually came on land in a kind of archipelago that embraced the Red Sea from Egypt to Aden and dotted across the Gulf from the 1850s all the way through World War I. And then, of course, we have a sort of second wave, if you will. From the 1960s or 1950s onward, we finally see the intermingling of American and British oil interests with the development of both water and electric infrastructures throughout the peninsula. Thus, rather than thinking of oil wealth buying desalination, we need to acknowledge that fossil fueled water had already arrived. And indeed, fossil fueled water was a precondition for the construction of the oil industry itself. In other words, I'm convinced that desalination requires us to dramatically rethink how we periodize and frame the history of water, energy, and climate in the region. If we're thinking about climate change and the future, I think we have to sort of stretch our time frame and not think about a 20th century oil boom, but really think about a fossil fueled history of the peninsula that stretches all the way back into the mid 19th century. Okay, I believe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. We will turn to Ekin.
I'll go ahead and share my screen. Are you all able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I would like to start by thanking James and Jared for the invitation for me to be part of this inspiring and very exciting panel and series. And also to everyone who put their labor in organizing this. It's a real honor to be in conversation with Nikhil and Chris here today. I should start by emphasizing that having recently returned from Turkey, where we have experienced a summer of multiple water-related socio-ecological disasters, this panel is particularly timely, relevant, and important to me. In May, Istanbulites got struck by what a prominent hydrobiologist called the decay of the corpse of one of the youngest, plentiful, and most interesting seas in the world, the Marmara Sea. The sea was covered with a thick blanket of sea snot, mucilage, caused by a phytoplankton overpopulation and explosion, leaving their intracellular liquid to the sea. Scientists explained that the decades-long discharge of urban pollution and industrial waste, combined with the detrimental effects of the industrial fishing and the rise in the sea temperature, caused this disaster. Mucilage was explained as the visible manifestation of the long continued death of the sea. At the end of July, shortly after the sea snot issue started to fade into the background, or better said, fall deep into the sea, the biggest forest fires in the Republican history struck the Aegean and Mediterranean regions. It was the hottest week of the season, and extreme drought had already been one of the most significant ecological concerns over the year. forestry experts and state institutions had been expecting an increase in the wildfires under these climate conditions. The disaster has destroyed 135,000 hectares of forest, taken 8 human and thousands of animal lives. When in mid-August, when the fires were finally under control after weeks of massive flames, severe floods and landslides turned the Western Black Sea region into a deadly zone. Extreme rainfall, coupled with inaccurate river reclamation projects and the construction of buildings and a timber storage facility on the floodplain, destroyed the entire towns and villages. I have received this invitation amidst all of these water-related crises. So thinking critically and carefully about how our attempts to shape water's flow in turn shapes the worlds we inhabit and study, as the panel puts it, felt absolutely vital in these times. As numerous scholars, including my co-panelists, have illustrated, casting water as a resource to be tapped, harnessed, tamed, and managed has been at the core of state and territory making projects and population control in diverse contexts in the Middle East. It seems like social, political, and economic relations in the region have been shaped around water alongside oil more than any other natural entity, environmental entity. Within this rich history and present, I would like to briefly focus on the rise of the idea of quote unquote natural resource development in the post-World War II context. Control and management of water was at the core of remaking the Middle East through the transfer and translation of the US expertise, knowledge, aid, and assistance for development. Hence, to the extent that building water infrastructures was a bordering and region-making practice, studying the process requires unmaking the borders analytically by attending to past and present forms of circulating knowledge, expertise, power, and materials. Begüm Adalet's recent book, for example, examines in detail how Turkey became a vital site for the production and validation of developmental thought and practice in the Cold War context. In her own words, in that period, Turkey became a site of fact-gathering and experimentation, as well as a ready-made model, especially for its neighbors across the Middle East. In his article, Turkey Aid for What?, published in 1947, Max Thornbuck, a senior executive in the Standard Oil Company in charge of its Middle East subsidiaries and a petroleum advisor to the US Department of the State, emphasizes Turkey's strategic importance for the US in the Middle East by stressing that Turkey is and I'm quoting from him, Turkey is a social and economic testing ground closely watched by the whole Arab world, unquote. To support this Orientalist point, he quotes an anonymous and stereotypical Arab who, as Thornbuck claimed, followed Turkey's development at a reachable distance. Quoting from him again, he said, British and American development is currently beyond us, an Arab had said. But what Turkey does today, we can do tomorrow, unquote. The expansion of water infrastructure construction in the region drew upon and reproduced through such imageries of Turkey and the Middle East together. Here, I would like to emphasize the building of infrastructures as an environmental project in the sense of redefining and reshaping ecologies. Specifically, the construction and consolidation of the idea of nature as a resource to be developed was at the core of Cold War technopolitics. The expansion of Tennessee Valley Authority to the Middle East as a model of regional development illustrates this point very clearly. The Tennessee Valley project started in 1933 as a large-scale integrated regional modernization program for the American South and entailed the construction of multiple dams, irrigation canals, flood control schemes, all to be undertaken by a public corporation, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Its global expansion as an American model of planned and liberal development blossomed in the Cold War context later. As part of the worldwide proliferation of dam construction and river basin development, a process defined by Chris Snedden as concrete revolution, the modular travel of TVA envisioned the development of the Middle East to be achieved through the water resource development. The 1950 article, TVAs in the Middle East, written by Felix Korchanski and William Diamond, both of them members of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and specializing in banks' Middle East activities. They stated that the popular imagination has been captured by the idea of development of entire river systems, with the result that great hopes have been attached to the control of the rivers of the Middle East as the means of increasing production and productivity, relieving population pressure, absorbing new population, and generally improving the economic conditions, unquote. Alongside the Litany project in Lebanon, they emphasized Turkey's potential for water development and cast it as a country in need of technical and economic assistance and an exemplar that can showcase the benefits of deploying the TVA idea. What was in circulation through TVA's dissemination was the politics of developing not only the nation state and the people, but also the natural resources. In this effort, the organizing discourse around dams was not merely taming and containing water. It was also about developing and putting them into work. That is, transforming them from a source of disaster and despair into a source of happiness and welfare. Dams therefore emerged and consolidated as a technopolitical tool of improving the region, its people, and its nature simultaneously. Here I would like to also note that we should of course bear in mind that dam building in Turkey was linked not only to the region making concerning the Middle East, but it was also at the same time crucially about the construction and containment of what is officially called the Southeastern Anatolia, the Kurdish region, Northern Kurdistan. I can talk about that in the Q&A if there's any interest. Fast forward to today, the series of ecological disasters I mentioned at the beginning of my talk shed light on the devastating implications of developmental thought and practices that drastically transformed human-water relationships. These crises require us to examine the predicaments of bordering practices realized through water infrastructures even more critically and closely. Nevertheless, I would also like to stress the possible limitations of our scholarly focus on water, especially concerning the Middle East. Political ecology, environmental history, and environmental anthropology of water are expanding and rising fields of study, which have challenged, amplified, and reshaped our conventional understanding of the Middle East as a region. Yet, on the other hand, the focus on water, I believe, carries the risk of rendering certain contexts and places more important than others. In other words, my suggestion is to carefully attend to scholarly knowledge production as a site of drawing boundaries. The critical question for me, and this is the Southeastern Anatolia project, which I forgot to put on screen. Sorry about that. Here, the critical question is to ask which political ecologies remain in the background as water is placed at the forefront of our attention, scholarly attention. Here, I do not mean to suggest a shift away from anthropologies or histories of water, for which for sure continues to be a vital topic to be explored further. Rather, what I propose is rethinking the analytical borders drawn among political matters such as water, soil, plants, fire, air, sand, etc. The climate change pushes us to attend to material intersections as disasters cannot be understood and examined as demarcated phenomena with clear-cut boundaries pertaining to a single material or ecological entity. This approach, in fact, has long been deployed in the environmental and technopolitical practices of governing powers and experts. Hence, a critical analysis needs to attend to the governmental approaches to these material intersections and entanglements. Moreover, the elites and governmental actors are not the only ones recognizing or claiming to manage these intersections. For instance, the importance of forest-water nexus is deployed by ecology activists and movements in forging claims against the encroachment of extraction and infrastructure industries to the forest landscapes. All of these points bring into stark relief the need to further expand our scholarship toward unmaking the boundaries between studies of water, soil, fire, air, oil, and so on. With its elaboration of diverse materialities and their entangled political past and present, this series, I believe, carves out a significant place for contemplating on this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eken. So we will do a little Zoom shuffle here and get everyone situated. We are coming into Q&A. So for the panelists, any questions, comments, alignments that you see between your work and what you've offered. And for those that are in the audience, you can raise your hand and we can put you up here on the Zoom screen. If you don't want to do that, we can unmute you and you can ask your question, or you're able to type it into the chat. So there's multiple ways for you to get involved. And maybe just to kind of get us started, again, these events we have are not necessarily as tight as some academic events, but rather, let's say, to use many of the terms we have on the table, a whirlwind, a storm, a cloud of issues from different perspectives, different disciplines. And so I think we, what Nikhil offered us was also a great starting point in framing. Nikhil, I love how you said water as a multiple and a mixture, bringing up Lembert's work of water is everywhere, Barnes's work of water is made. And then two, specific interventions in different locations of a history, and a little bit of a pushback. And so one thing that that just came to mind, and Chris, I was just wondering specifically if you could bring this up, because one thing that Nikhil raised was the hydropolitics, and if I understood it correctly, basically climate change is starting to show us the cracks in the walls, or I think you even said the leakages, right? Where climate change in terms of, let's say, less reliable weather or more extreme water events is changing the game board, so to speak. And so one thing that really struck me that was interesting in your presentation in the GCC was not the scarcity, but the overabundance of water being something that was, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think the GCC has some of the highest usage per capita. And so one thing I just wanted to maybe kind of put back to all of you, and maybe Chris, if you could start, was just that changing value that really comes back to maybe the power, the state, that some of what Nikhil was mentioning in the beginning, because the GCC seems to be making water usage not even seen or felt.
Yeah, look, I think that that's sort of a key issue here, is that the sort of expandability of water resources seem to go hand in hand in the latter half of the 20th century with the expansion of availability of oil. And I think that the problem that I'm pointing to is that all of this sort of civilization in the Gulf, if you will, is undergirded by oil consumption, massive amounts of energy consumption, but it's also paid for by those revenues, right? And so as we sort of peer into a 21st century where we're trying to imagine a less carbon-centric world, it's very difficult to see how you square that equation. And I think that some of my engineering friends, some of the more technically inclined, would say, well, we'll switch to different sources of energy. United Arab Emirates is moving towards nuclear power. But the number of plants spread across the peninsula and the cost to replace those, to retrofit those, to switch energy resources, and the time needed to do it is profound in comparison with the timeline and the speed, the rate at which we're sort of seeing changes to the environment. So I just don't see that equation being balanced in the latter half of the 21st century.
Again, Nikhil, any comment right there?
Yeah, I would maybe make a small contribution there in terms of thinking through leakage, being more exposed in the times of climate change. The mucilage example that I gave in the beginning also makes me think about how sometimes overproduction of certain other elements, not necessarily only leakage maybe, but also overproduction or suddenly the burst of other materials and elements already existing in the water, in the seawater, becomes, plays like a role like a leakage exposed during the times of the climate change, something, the pollution not really being able to, not being traceable by ordinary citizens in their daily lives, suddenly becomes exposed through overpopulation, overproduction of certain other elements, is really, I think, another way that we can think about leakage, and also suddenly the sea, which seemed to be, again, this abundant resource to be used and tapped, its long dying process suddenly becomes exposed in the eyes of everyone, which also turns it into actually a scarce resource, maybe changing its value in the time of climate change. So I really find it productive to think with.
I really liked Akin's provocation to think about or rethink the analytical borders between water and other materialities. And I'd love to hear speak more with soil as well. But thinking with Chris's, I mean, I think Akin's point is actually sort of like very well supported in the work that Chris is doing in showing how it's kind of impossible to think about the ways in which water is made and produced in the Gulf without thinking of the possibilities afforded to those systems by oil, right? Both in terms of like revenues, but also perhaps as like energy source for desal plants that are extremely energy intensive operations, right? Now, all of that is sort of predicated on an assumption that we can like fit as we as humans that can sit on like stably constructed infrastructures that will behave as they ought. But I think what Akin's work is actually pointing to is even something as steady as the sea or as unsteady as the sea cannot be depended on for even for things like desalination operations in the future, right? So there are going to be certain events that are already present and in the near future where we reminded again and again that we live in the entangled social materialities of our environment as opposed to on top of stable performances often made by infrastructure.
I mean, I just wanted to jump in and sort of piggyback off Akin's comments about mucilage and think a little bit about algal blooms as related to desalination, right? So this is something that is understood and sort of built into the life of this particular infrastructure, that there's so much brine produced that you get algal blooms. And in fact, the sort of salinity of the Persian Gulf is rising quite dramatically. As Gökçe Günel has mused, perhaps we're not looking at peak oil, we're looking at peak salt, right? Is there a sort of tipping point at which you can no longer depend on, as Akin points out, this seemingly steady resource, right? The sea or the ocean is so big, it couldn't possibly be overused, overtapped. But of course, we're sort of bumping up against those ecological limits sort of at every turn.
Not just the limits, but also just this larger idea of a balance, right? Of something getting so out of skew, the ecology, the weather. Again, I just keep coming back listening to what you guys were saying, the expectations we have and how weak we are and the infrastructure we've built to be able to accommodate that. And so the balance being out of whack and these extreme events that render the road a river.
Just to add a quick note on that, actually, it's when we think about mucilage, definitely the balance as a question and concept becomes important, because these phytoplanktons are usually in the water always. Their kind of normal, quote unquote, normal level of existence in the sea doesn't really create a problem. It's part of the ecosystem, actually. What is the problem? It becomes a problem with pollution, of course. Their overproduction, and then suddenly, because of this overproduction, they burst and leaving unbearable amounts of sea snot into the water. So it's also the question of balance, and the tipping points are always important to become more and more important to consider.
I think the sea snot example, I'm thinking of phytoplankton blooms, is actually another great illustration of how, like, unmaking water as a resource, or thinking about water as more than a resource in some ways, blows open our understandings of, like, discrete regions of the world, right? I'm thinking in the chat, I'm thinking of this paper by Joachim Goes and Helga Gomes, who are mapping the flows of Noctiluca scintillans between the Arabian Peninsula and India, actually, and showing that these ecologies are part and deeply intertangled on account of rising sea surface temperatures, pollution, but also like sea container traffic, right? So to think about the ways in which this region is kind of like, like unbundling water is also about unbundling the region, or regional approaches to these questions that we've long been pursuing.
I mean, this question of connecting the Middle East and South Asia has long been a preoccupation in my work for different reasons. But this project and spending some time in Abu Dhabi has sort of gotten me thinking in different ways about this. If you sort of look at the heat projection maps for the 21st century, the Gulf, Iran, Pakistan, and India light up in ways that perhaps no other place on the planet do. And it suggests, I think, as Nikhil is suggesting, a different region than what we've previously imagined, right? So a sort of a mapping of climate change that's emerging in front of our eyes that I think shifts our regional focus and the kinds of connections that I think that we need to be drawing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if I can just say from behind the curtain here, it's also Nikhil's work is, I think, really at the center of this conversation, but also, one thing we try to do in the events is expand the geography of what is the Middle East, other perspectives that really relate to it. And so thank you for highlighting that, Chris. Just a reminder, we have 3 different experts, scholars, practitioners here. You might have a question related to this broad theme of water that you might feel is a little bit out of left field, but I just want to say that you can throw it on the table here. So I also there was a question here in the chat, Nikhil, if you wanted to maybe mention a little bit about some of your larger work, doing field work, methodologies of how you've perhaps approached this overflowing vessel of what water is.
Sure. So I guess, I'm sort of interested in many waters, but I can only follow some at a time, right? And so the first project on water supply infrastructures in the city was in response to a certain set of questions. First, around the controversies and possibilities of neoliberal restructuring and water privatization in the city, and the possibilities it afforded, and the possibilities that public systems afforded residents of the city. And so, in that project, I dwelled particularly in the work and everyday lives of those living in cities' informal settlements, and joined it to some field work I was doing with city engineers as they were moving around the city, moving water, not only in the city, but also to the city. And so, because I was interested in how public infrastructures work, I was working with public officials as they worked to join water pipes or not to people living in informal settlements. For the second project, I'm trying to rethink the solidity of cities and to ask what might happen if we think about cities as made of water in many different senses. And for this, I'm doing work with fishers and oceanographers, pollution scientists that are doing work in the seas around Mumbai. And of course, what is a sea around Mumbai is a good question, because it's at different scales, and that's actually part of my interest too, right? The ways in which these translocal phenomena, such as algal blooms, interact with coastal pollution of the kind that Akhil was talking about, but also processes unfolding at different temporalities, like sea surface temperatures. And so I guess for that, I'm trying to understand how fishers and scientists sense the city in the sea, as a way of getting to those kinds of processes and answers to these issues.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I thought I might jump in here because I've received a question anonymously through the chat, and then I have a question of my own. And thanks again for some wonderful and thought-provoking interventions into this discussion, and I think it's so far been everything that we've often expected of you all. So I'll start. I got this anonymous question directly to me, so I'll relay that, and then I have my own. They're asking, they're wondering what, in your opinion, is the greatest challenge concerning freshwater availability and national security in the region going forward. It's kind of putting something up on a tee here to pull an example. But maybe my own question might be a little bit related to that. I was really struck by Nikhil's mention of like the unmaking of water as a resource, and in relation to the sea snot issue, like sort of like this explosion of our idea of the water as like a limiting or unlimited presence. I wonder what you all see as the infrastructural reactions to that kind of a realization on our part. I mean, I think in Turkey, sort of it's hard not to think of sea snot as being partly a consequence of pollution caused by the use of the Bosphorus Straits as a waterway that's been over-trafficked for many, many, many years. And at the same time, think about the kinds of mega projects that the AKP has proposed, including building a second Bosphorus, effectively a canal that bypasses the Bosphorus Straits and into the Marmara Sea, and sort of as an opportunity to think about not just how these kinds of revelations might affect the course of those kinds of infrastructural projects, but also how we might respond to or change our criticisms of those kinds of propositions.
That's for anybody. That the two questions. So kind of freshwater, national security, and then what Jim just offered, if people have thoughts on that.
I'll tackle the national security question very briefly, and just by way of an example, right? So the rhetoric around Saudi and UAE conflict in Yemen. Of course, oil facilities have long been an object of sort of extreme securitization, but more frequently you hear commentary about, well, what if a drone struck a desalination facility? The impact would be, quite horrific. Now, in the case of the Houthis and Yemen, of course, it's difficult to sort of tease out the degree to which this is actually a national security priority or it's propaganda, right? To sort of shift blame. But I think that this sort of brings up the question of sort of thinking about all of these issues as either a reality of infrastructural intervention or a kind of PR and advertising campaign. I mean, I think that was sort of the thing that really struck me spending the year this past year in the Gulf was how much of what is talked about is real and how much is illusory as a kind of PR greenwashing campaign. You do get the sense that there is some urgency around infrastructural interventions, but they, in my opinion, tend to sort of intensify resource usage and fossil fuel usage rather than sort of alleviate the situation. They sort of double down. And so it's always difficult to sort of figure out if those new interventions are adding anything or if they just sort of exacerbate the issue.
Just to follow on this pair of questions, I think I can think of them at once. In some ways, the kinds of emergencies and security vulnerabilities that are described around water resources are a justification for and also an outcome of technocratic state interventions, right? And so, there is no national security issue for a river that is undammed, for example, right? It only comes about when the river is dammed. So that's one way to sort of like think about it. In some ways, that water infrastructures are seen to be sites of vulnerability of different kinds of security threats and claims, but they're actually key in producing those threats and claims as well. And I think this is, you can think about this this as also one of the ways in which these infrastructures are sort of like legitimized, is that as an emergency response to water insecurity or questions of pollution and so on, when in fact they're in key technologies to produce those very same risks. And thereby legitimize the state. So
maybe just to jump in right here, I would also like to flip that question a little bit and see dams as tools of security, as really securitized, instead of dams, providing fresh water vis-a-vis in face of national security problems of shortage, etc. It's actually in the Turkish case, it's actually that the dam building has been a tool of securitization, especially in the Kurdish region that I have mentioned. This gives me a little bit of also chance to reflect on that. That from the beginning of the dam building projects in Turkey, it has been always very explicitly a security tool of actually taming and putting and containing the Kurdish region under control, which has been usually what we see in the dam building is a security apparatus. This would be a little bit of kind of an overt, a hidden agenda in the state building process, whereas in Turkey you can find in archives and newspapers and everywhere that it was from the beginning very explicitly securitized, the security part of the security apparatus. So in that sense, it was part of the border making practice too. And very recently, also Turkey's expansion of dams along the Syrian border, for example, as the state officials themselves have framed those dams as security dams, dams as borders themselves, securing the national borders, etc., which has been a narrative then denied by the state officials, by the way, but they have put it on the table. So before denying it. So I think we can think about national security and water availability in different ways through these cases. And maybe just to sorry, did I hear anyone?
Continue.
Okay. And maybe, of course, about the second question, James' question, I really like the way you posed the question in terms of what kinds of infrastructure responses those crises create. And definitely here what we see especially in the mucilage case, is what the responses that we see is what Chris has mentioned in terms of protecting the status quo, actually, coming up, the governmental officials coming up with solutions of collecting mucilage and storing it somewhere else, basically cleaning the surface of the sea, making it to seem clean again and storing it somewhere else, creating further problems. It was never really very clear where that storage would be, which conditions and how. And then what they would do with that storage of sea snot, etc. And so that was one way of seemingly creating a solution or bringing a change, but actually it's what Gökçe's, in Gökçe's terms, would be technical adjustments, just creating, just preserving the status quo situation. Also, but further than that, more than that, they also used the crisis as an opportunity to kind of justify the existing devastating, not only maintaining the status quo, but like furthering the expansion of infrastructure projects such as the canal you have mentioned, James. Some government officials started to say that actually the canal, the Crazy Canal, the second Bosphorus to be opened in Istanbul, which is a very debated, controversial project, will be actually a solution to the sea snot problem, because it will save the Bosphorus from the transportation traffic and its pollution, etc. So, but also, of course, these are always, as Nikhil's work beautifully also shows, these are always contested propositions and contested processes. So also, on the other hand, the activists have not used, but like have shown that the sea snot problem actually shows us that the canal proposition will further the problem rather than solve it, actually. So, but so far, unfortunately, there is no radical solution proposed in terms of cutting the urban pollution, stopping the discharge of industrial and urban waste has been the infrastructural response, which was pushed by the activists and scientists. So far, we haven't seen anything about that.
Thanks. And yeah, you're right. I mean, and if you think about it for 2 seconds, the idea that the canal project will somehow save the death of the Marmara Sea doesn't make any sense at all, because the canal is going to empty into the Marmara Sea anyway. You know, they're not changing the where the flow is going, really. They're just bypassing the Bosphorus. Yeah, thanks so much for that. Jared, I think there's questions that I pasted in.
Yeah. Yes, so there was a question in the chat from, I think, Michael, and I think we kind of looped into this a little bit, just this larger question of political conflict. And again, I think you actually kind of unknowingly were kind of addressing this with the Kurdish population, even on the Syrian border, but specifically this securitization, or, you know, if we maybe even extend this, not just securitization, but the access to something you need to exist and live, and who has the power to give that to you at what times. And we can think, in the question Cyprus was brought up, we can probably name, so many places across the world, between countries, within countries, between populations, minorities, etc. There was also an anonymous question. It's a little bit broad. This person is asking specifically about rain and sea level rising in Greenland, but maybe just to kind of zoom it out a little bit, we have been talking a lot about the sea and the oceans. So if you all, from maybe your specific geography, this is maybe a zooming out question, might have something to speculate or offer in the context, of with increasing sea levels, what comes to mind, maybe how you think local authorities, laws are changing, something that you might want to offer in this conversation with the sea level rising.
I can start.
Please.
Yeah, so I think sea level rise is also another very good example of how you might think of these as global phenomena, as phenomena that are taking place everywhere, but even sea level rise is different depending on where in the world you are. The amount of sea level rise, it's not like there's a universal figure for sea level rise. There's different in different geographies and seas based on basin and tidal patterns. But to think about the importance of those specificities, I think is not just a theoretical question, right? But to think about how these then relate to these extant ecologies. I think, Mumbai has started doing an active climate adaptation planning process. It's one I'm following closely. But I think while it is promising, I think one of the problems with it is that they're doing what Etienne told us not to do, right? It's to see water, earth, fire, and air as different ecologies that don't interrelate or interact with each other. And of course, sea level rise not only interact with coastal pollution and storm surges or cyclones, which are themselves a phenomena that come about out of an interaction of water and air in the oceans, but also the ways in which these are made into disasters depending on infrastructure assemblages on land, right? And so I think the call to try and think relationally across our different elements is a really good one, not just as a matter of theory making, but also practical engagements around climate adaptation and mitigation more broadly. And I think Chris's work about focusing on the relationships between energy and oil and water is another instance of the need to think relationally across different elements, of which I think is one.
So I'll take a stab at this in a quite strange and maybe slightly off-kilter way. I've been working on sort of adjacent issues in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf related to sort of fantasies and projects around geoengineering. Cloud seeding is one, but I wound up sort of down the rabbit hole, so to speak, following Mohammed bin Faisal, who was really the man who was responsible for the Saline Water Conversion Corporation's rise in Saudi Arabia. And it turns out in 1977 that he was behind an international conference to tow icebergs to Saudi Arabia that was actually hosted at Iowa State University. It was a sort of strange, confluence of the universe to bring me and that archive together. But this idea of, obviously we think about melting polar landscapes, right? As we desperately need to keep those landscapes, the water, fresh water, locked up in those places. But the view from the 1970s was this was yet another sort of region to be mined, a sort of infinitely expandable set of resources. And this has kind of been an interesting way for me to think about attitudes towards the sea and the sort of expandability, limitlessness, if you will, of seawater and its exploitation. So sea level rise, maybe not directly, but I just think that this sort of overarching attitude that oil produces is important for us to think about. And just as a kind of final side note, this project actually has been bandied about even more recently in the last 5 years. A character named Abdallah Shehi, working out of Masdar City in Abu Dhabi, sort of resurrected this idea of towing icebergs yet again. So, you know, we're still in the sort of same situation with these kinds of geoengineering fantasies in the Gulf.
Can you have something to add to that, or no?
Not so many points I would have in addition to Nikhil's and Chris's, because of the, I think also the contextual situation in Turkey is that, you know, the sea level rise has not been really a topic on the agenda necessarily. There are different more kind of urgent discussions going on about rainfall and floods and so on and so forth, but not necessarily sea level rising and the rainfall. The mitigation, basically the mitigation practices are not yet very much at the center of the political agenda and discussion. Of course, there are groups, environmental justice activists who are pushing for these concerns to become really a kind of an important topic on the agenda, but in terms of propositions and projects developed, there isn't much there yet, actually.
Great. So there's one question in the chat, which I will, you know, it seems to relate to waste containment, where it should go. How do we keep it? This is from Miranda. Water is broadly seen as cleansing or at least neutral. Of course, when it comes to containment, water gets polluted. I wonder if the panel could comment on what these transformations of water might do to reposition it as itself a contaminator, a generator of waste, rather than something that gets contaminated itself. Again, so kind of what Ekin was doing, let's flip this and what that might mean. Is there an angle here around unbundling regions, undoing separations as well in the sense of contagion? And Miranda was mentioning Chris's work with waterborne diseases there. If anyone has thoughts on that.
So maybe on the question of containment, I would just draw your attention to a scholar who's working at NYU Abu Dhabi, Kamal Chalik, who's been working on using brine as building material. So sequestering, you know, reject brine from desalination, and instead of pumping it back into the ocean, using it as useful materials. This is really exciting work. Again, I guess my caution is, can this be produced at scale in time to meet the challenges that we're facing in a sort of limited time frame? But this sort of question of containment or sequestration, I think, you know, we tend to think of it as CO2 emissions, but brine is sort of the other one in this case that I think is really useful and connects with what Ekin was talking about. You know, what do you do with this excess algal bloom or a sea snot?
I really liked the way the question is posed in terms of the rivers, the waters being killed, but at the same time becoming a mechanism of killing or polluting, especially concerning the public health. One concept that conceptual thinking that comes to my mind is revolves around the fact that, you know, it's really hard to trace especially again going back to the mucilage example, one of the one of the scientists who are working tracing the Marmara Sea pollution problem was saying that, okay, there are sites of pollution coming into the sea that we can depict, like, and we can totally pinpoint at in terms of also, which is easier to maybe than contain, as Chris was saying, than manage. But there are also other sources of pollution coming through the tributaries, through different rivers and underground water, especially pollutions, agricultural pesticides induced pollution, which is kind of very, very capillary, which ends up in the sea, but we can't really trace it or locate the source. When it is an industrial waste, you can know where the discharge is located, but there are other types of pollution that is very capillary coming with the rivers or other sources of water, which are themselves turn out to be pollutants themselves, and it is really hard to trace and contain, and so different mechanisms have to be developed in order to attend to that problem. So containment may be part of what many people are thinking about when it comes to solution, but then what do we do with these distributed and not really traceable leakings?
Yeah, I think Jim got some anonymous questions. We have perhaps a shy group today for our first event who don't want to speak, but they're passing it along.
Yeah, so I've got two anonymous questions that actually, serendipitously address similar issues, particularly pointing at political economy and sovereignty within this discussion. The first of these are, sort of notes the way, and is thinking about the way, for instance, grassroots communities, the way we talk about water infrastructure projects or projects towards environmentalism and conservation tend to focus on the ecological rather than the diplomatic or the political in an attempt to sort of transgress or transcend borders, political borders, but then sooner or later run into this problem of political sovereignty, sooner or later run into the problem of, different governments at loggerheads with one another over various other issues, and having all that getting loaded onto their particular problem. And then the second of these, I asked a little bit more directly of each of the panelists, what water infrastructure projects have you encountered that cross political borders, and in so doing, change the way we understand both political and natural geography? We pointed a little bit to this, I think, earlier in the discussion when Chris brought up the heat map, that's sort of rethinking, the sense of a region around the Gulf. But perhaps there's ways in which the infrastructure projects themselves start, breaking down our senses of what a border really is.
Thanks, Jim. So any thoughts on either of those questions, things that come to mind?
I can start, I guess. I think, like thinking relationally and across different ecologies and borders around questions of water and water infrastructures is actually, in some ways, for me at least, a response to produce a different understanding of both politics and also potentiality in terms of how to respond to these kinds of questions, as opposed to trying to evaluate politics from the question itself, right? And so very different political borders than those of the nation state, but I'm thinking of borders between rural and urban areas, for example, and the ways in which inequities are produced through the movement of water across different borders, right? So let me make a very simple example. In Mumbai and in the region around Mumbai, on one hand, water is moved from rural areas to the city, dehydrating quite literally the farms of people that are living close to these water sources, because the city is seen to need water based on its large population. But once water crosses those borders, water is being delivered to legally and through like legitimate connections to a fraction of that city, right? And because the questions of water are divided into rural and urban inequalities, paying attention to one scale or the other actually evaluates the ways in which you know, water infrastructure is actually like rather expensive, right? When seen relationally moving and distributing water from one location to a small part of another geography, right? Populations are played off against each other. So I think that's one of the reasons to think across borders is not, and to think ecologically and relationally across borders is not to depoliticize, but to show how politics is actually performed by bordering practices that water infrastructures perform. So I think that was my response to the first question. And you know, I think in relation to the second question, I'm thinking also of the borders, and this is like maybe not where the questioner was asking the question from, between what is seen to be city and environment in the second project. You know, in response to the question in the chat, thinking of water as contaminating, it's impossible to like think of contamination outside of human practices or pollution outside of human practices, because contamination and pollution themselves are categories of understanding human intervention in the environment, right? Without humans, is there pollution? But to then think about the ways in which this pollution is actually materialized and experienced through and with water as it travels across different geographies and borders, I think is key, right? So where I work, much of the oil drilling that happens in offshore wells and the everyday leakages of oil infrastructure on Bombay Highs, about 50 miles outside the city, produces ecologies of pollution on and around the city's beaches and waterways and waterfronts, right? And so here again is another way in which I think thinking about the movements of water across borders with and without infrastructures allows us a mechanism of attributing political responsibility as opposed to not doing that, you know, which is, I think, not, at least not my intention in the work that I do. It's to make it visible, make political accountability visible.
I just wanted to put maybe just one empirical example coming from my own fieldwork around these questions of cross-border waters and then sovereignty issues, is that my work is located in northeastern Turkey at the Çoruh River Basin, which is actually on the border with Georgia. So the river runs through Turkey, majority of the river, and then it ends up in the Black Sea, across the Georgian border. So there, what I observed, and this is something that really, it's something that really pushed me to think about the intersectionality of materials that I have mentioned, because it's there. When I started doing the fieldwork, I realized, especially through people's discourses around how dams to be constructed on the Çoruh are not going to hold only the water in the reservoirs, but also they are going to hold the soil, which was carried by the river all the way to the Georgian Delta. So there was this nationalistic, actually border-making discourse that dams are going to hold back our soil and prevent it from running all the way to Georgia to create a fertile valley there. Instead, we are going to kind of, through dams, even though it's not going to be usable, I mean, the soil is going to be accumulating in the reservoir, but there was still the circulating discourse of how dams will hold back the soil that actually, they were saying, pertains to the to the Turkish territory. So how actually the flow of cross-border flow of water also comes with questions of soil and keeping the soil back in the national territory, and it becomes suddenly also an issue of sovereignty actually as well. Was really interesting for me to think with.
I would just maybe add a couple of examples of, in this case, desalination as a sort of infrastructural escape route from international weakness or dependency. So one historical example and one more recent one. In the 1950s and previously, Kuwait was dependent on shipping water from Iraq, and so became terribly dependent on Iraq for fresh water. So obviously the solution was to invest massively in desalination facilities and really become sort of the first Gulf sort of power in that technology. But a more recent example, right, we're seeing what's happening between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance Dam. Right, so now Egypt is starting to eye the intensification of desalination as a possible escape from that particular situation. So again, desal is a sort of a miracle drug, if you will, in these situations. Although obviously there are downsides, but it's almost seen as a panacea for these kinds of situations.
Well, we're approaching 2 o'clock here. If there are no further questions, anything that anyone is really itching to get out, I wanted to thank Ekin, Chris, Akil for coming, for engaging, the thoughtful provocations that you put on the table. And Ekin, you personally, I love your, and we're going to take this for the whole series of, it's not just about Earth, it's not just about air, of actually the kind of larger systems, the relationships, the intersections between all of these things that we're trying to kind of build out of these conversations. So thank you all 3 for being here. Everybody in the audience, thank you for coming. There's 3 more events for 3 more elements this semester. We hope to see you there. And we will end the recording now.